because they are not necessarily shareable. As brilliant as we may find our own epiphanies to be, others maybe not. You know? This happened with opera for me. Like, I thought it was ridiculous. My entire, like, why would anybody do that? And then one day, and it wasn't even a great opera that I saw that changed me. One day I was walking past Juilliard, and there was a girl I saw in a window doing her scales. That's all she was doing. And not particularly well, I might add. She was on her way to being a good singer. She was still working some stuff out. And yet, there was something about her doing that that made me go, huh, what an interesting pursuit that someone has devoted themselves to. And the next time somebody invited me to go to the Met with them, I didn't say, no, I'm busy. I went. And even though I didn't get it, it was in another language, and I thought it was a little stagey and cornball, I still was so amazed that people went out and did it that I was utterly taken, and now I'm an opera fan. And I still don't understand most of what I'm about. And I don't like to read the, what's it called? The libretto. The libretto. I don't like to read that. I don't like to read a translation because then I can't. I'm just amazed they do it. That they can do that. I'm astounded by it. And I'll go anytime. I will pay big money and little money. I'll see poopy opera companies and great ones because I'm just astonished by the fact that people do that. I had this with hip-hop. For the first seemingly 28 years it was around, I was like, why do they do that? What are they talking about? Every single song sounds like I just didn't get it. And then one day I happened to see Tupac do something, and I went, this is poetry. This is art. And all of a sudden I began to see rappers and hip-hop artists in an entirely different way, and now I'm rather a big fan. How do you know? And it's one, I'm glad. And all my friends that tried to turn me on to it, I said, you're crazy. It's ridiculous. All right. Sometimes they are flashes of clarity, and they're hard-earned, and other times they just come along as a pure blessing. Most of the time we have them on our own, by ourselves, and sometimes we have them with others. Sometimes we're sitting with a group of people and everybody's mind is shifted in a moment. That's a miraculous thing. Last year, it's more than a year and a half ago, when I went to the inauguration, I had that moment. I'd been a Obama supporter, I was fully into it, but I was sitting there freezing my ass off under the Washington Monument. Obama was a good mile up the, thing. I could barely see the Capitol, let alone him taking the oath of office. But they had these giant Cinetrons, or whatever those big screens are, and and all of a sudden I looked up there. And I was standing with a bunch of African American folks just by where I was standing. I was standing with all of these people that were just there. I didn't know them. And there were about 3 white folks and about, in my vicinity, about 30, 40 black folks. And this moment happened. Sorry. And I felt something that I couldn't have felt except there at that moment with them. And I don't know how it is to be an African American person and have that moment happen. I don't know. I'm not an African American person. How would I know? And yet, something about being there at that moment with them let me have as much of that moment as I could have. And even though I was happy at the nomination and happy at the election, and I predicted it, when I saw him give that address at the previous convention 4 years earlier, I went, that guy's going to be the President of the United States. He is going to be the first African-American President of the United States. Now, I didn't think it would be 4 years later. I thought it would be 8 years or 12 years or 16 years later. I sure didn't think it would be 4 years later. But I just knew. And so to have that pay off for me, as a white American, there amongst a lot of African Americans, it was, my life will never be the same. It will never be the same because of that. Now, the whole country's life may never be the same, and African Americans' lives may never be the same. A lot of people, in fact. But I had my own little moment where I know that half the people in the mall that day had a moment like that. You know, some people were just there freezing their feet off because it was really cold. But some people were going, wow, that sort of changes everything up. That's interesting. You know, can't exactly think about things in exactly the same way anymore. Games change. You know, I know a lot of people were having that experience. I certainly did. So let's go back to the definition, because that's where the answers always are. What do words mean? A sudden, intuitive perception of, or insight into, the reality or the essential meaning of something, usually initiated by some simple, homely, or commonplace occurrence or experience. So, sudden. I found a quote about the suddenness of Epiphany. This is what Story Musgrave, who is an American scientist who is also an astronaut. Story Musgrave said this: "And so, I was not a military test pilot, but as soon as NASA expressed an interest in flying scientists and people who were not military test pilots, that was an epiphany that came to me like a stroke of lightning." And he suddenly left the college he was teaching in, applied for the astronaut program, and got to orbit the Earth and the space station. And it was at that moment, like a stroke of lightning, that he suddenly went, oh, you don't have to be a test pilot, you don't have to be, just on the radio, you know, looking for scientists willing to fly. Life spun around, and he went from being an astrogeophysics professor to being an astronaut. Like a stroke of lightning. That's how they are. Yeah? Bang. It can happen in a dream. It can happen in the spotlight. As I was thinking about when it can happen, I've had a couple of epiphanies while making love that didn't have anything to do with the making love experience. Some other aspect of my life. Now, maybe I should have had my mind on the business at hand, but I don't know. Something about the euphoria and joy of the business at hand opened my mind to some other kind of thing. And for me, I actually had my first experience of my own spiritual life, not the one taught to me by my parents, which was lovely, but I had my own understanding of the concept of God. And not because it was particularly fantastic lovemaking, but because my mind was just present in a way that allowed me to be open to something that daily life wasn't allowing me to be open to, the beginning of my own spiritual life. Epiphany. So, don't try to make them happen. Don't try to make them important. Don't push them. They just happen. They're an act of God or nature or an accident, however you want to look at it. But they cannot be rehearsed, planned, asked for, requested, paid for. None of that. And you've got to allow yourself to see them. Pushing on them makes them just dodge for cover, in my experience. Yeah. Intuitive. That's the next piece of this definition that's important. And another quotation from Nick Cave, who some of you know is an Australian musician. Nick Cave said this: "An artist's duty is rather to stay open-minded and in a pure state where he can receive information and inspiration. You always have to be ready for that little artistic epiphany." It's intuitive. It just comes. Let me define intuition for you. The direct perception of truth, fact, etc., independent of any reasoning process, any immediate apprehension, and it is composed entirely of faith and vision. That's intuition. Faith and vision in the moment. And that is what epiphanies provide. Suddenly you know. Didn't know before, suddenly you know.